Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you all here, and thanks for joining in, and thanks for participating in everyone else's practice, supporting everyone who is here. A couple of people indicated they couldn't be here because they're traveling. That must be a relief for them after so many months of being at home. So we wish them well. We wish them safe travels. So the last few weeks, we've been talking about the Eightfold Path. And the next step in the Eightfold Path that we'll be discussing today is right livelihood. Sama ajivo, right livelihood. And actually, the more I think about this topic, the more complicated it gets. So I hope I don't end up just introducing confusion here. The Buddha talked about right livelihood in this way by telling us 5 means of livelihood, of earning a living, that he considered wrong livelihood. He said business in weapons, wrong livelihood. Business in human beings, trading slaves or prostitutes is wrong livelihood. Business in meat, selling meat, butchering meat. Business in intoxicants, and business in poisons. Well, that sounds okay, but it seems a little anachronistic. He was talking about fifth century or 6th century BC India, and not our sort of complicated, interconnected world. So in our complicated, interconnected world, I'm not sure that advice is as helpful. For instance, is it wrong to work at the hardware store because they sell rat poison there? Is it wrong to work for Amazon because they sell everything? Is it wrong to deliver groceries because somebody might order a bottle of liquor or a pork chop? Somehow it seems kind of hard to apply these things nowadays, and any sense of purity seems like an illusion. I mean, is there purity anywhere? The vocation of medicine seems noble in a way, and there is some nobility about it. It's the way I've spent my life. But it's complicated, because in our healthcare system, I would say it's more of an industry than a system. Even corporations that call themselves non-for-profit, nonprofit, are revenue driven. And almost everyone who works in healthcare works for some sort of relatively large corporation that, because the way we have set things up, is revenue driven. So there tends to be an emphasis on high-tech, high-cost procedures rather than on basic public health and preventative care. The reason for this is to sustain revenues, obviously, but the weakness of it has been revealed by our current situation, the COVID pandemic, to which we have responded relatively poorly. Not to mention the fact that medical debt is one of the major causes of impoverishment in our country. So I don't overlook those factors. And I think any sense of purity about all this is somewhat illusory. Clearly, this applies more to some than others. So I thought last week, when we were talking about right action and abstaining from killing living beings, Marilyn brought up an excellent point. Well, what about self-defense? Aren't there occasions when killing is justified? So that brought to mind articles that I had read in the past, written by people who have thought about, or actually are involved in, being in the military as a Buddhist. And I distributed those. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at them. And I didn't do that in order to sort of initiate a complicated debate about just wars, but just to highlight the complexity of all of this. And our thoughts about this, I'm sure, are colored by our personal experience. For a variety of reasons, I went off to college when I was relatively young, and that was in 1966, at which time there were 385,000 troops, American troops, in Vietnam. And by the time I reached draft age 2 years later, there were 535,000 troops in Vietnam, almost a 40% increase. And it didn't look like there was any end in sight. When I arrived at campus as a freshman, the mall was mostly used for people on nice days, either sunning themselves or studying in the shade. And 2 years later, it was mostly used for demonstrations, which occurred regularly. So at that time, there was a draft lottery. And reaching draft age, I participated in that lottery, and you get a number, and you don't know how far down on the list they're going to go, because it depends on how many more tens of thousands of troops they send to Vietnam. And my appraisal of the situation was that this was an unjust war. And of course, I was supported in that by virtually all of my peers at the time. So it wasn't a courageous decision on my part. So my sort of immature adolescent mind decided that the best thing to do would be to tear up my draft card and send it back to the draft board, which I did. And charitably, they did nothing about that. It's actually a felony, but they did nothing about it. No response. So the next thing I did was apply for conscientious objection status. Well, my draft board was a small rural draft board in southern Indiana. Mostly people who were on it were farmers or small businessmen. And I had to go down there and talk with them. And I wasn't a Mennonite. I wasn't a Quaker. I didn't even belong to a church. So it was a hard sell. But somehow they approved my application for conscientious objector status. As it turned out, they never got down to my number and I wasn't drafted. I did, however, end up spending a year working in a hospital before starting medical school alongside Mennonites who were doing their service. So my feelings about military service are deeply colored by my experience. But over the years, my thoughts about all of this have become more nuanced. And I recognize that there are situations in which killing to protect innocence may be justified and may even be considered necessary. And I also have tremendous respect for people who are willing to put life and limb at risk in order to do what they perceive is noble. So I found these articles, and there are others out there as well. I just sent two of the shorter ones, interesting and helpful. And I think it goes to demonstrate how any sense of purity that we may have is illusory, because we are all connected to this activity in one way or another. And right livelihood, I think also in addition to how we earn a living, also includes how we spend our life. how we spend what resources we have, what comes to us, how we use it. And here again, I think it's hard to find purity. I'm rather fond of coffee. And it comes in these sort of pleasing packages at the grocery store. And it's easy to brew up. But where does coffee come from? Coffee comes from parts of the world with relatively fragile ecosystems. It comes from parts of the world that are relatively poor compared to where I live. It comes from parts of the world where maybe if there's anything grown on this land, it ought to be food. And this is not even to mention the carbon footprint left by transporting the coffee, roasting the coffee, packaging it in packages that are usually not recyclable. So there's a certain amount of all of that in each cup of coffee. And I also recognize that many people are employed by the coffee industry and depend on it for their livelihood. So it's complicated. I've come to think that it's not so much what we do, but how we do it. I had the experience in the last 6 weeks or so of going to the DMV twice in Overland, the Overland DMV on Page. So I got to witness sort of how they're doing things now with the threat of coronavirus. And they're, I'm sure some of you have been to the DMV and seen, and been stood in lines that are outside with everyone 6 feet apart with a mask. And both times I went there, I noticed they had hired I guess you would call it a greeter almost. Someone that comes out and checks with you and when you're standing in line, do you want a driver's license or do you want plates? Because they don't let anyone into the room where the clerks are. They just let people in one at a time. And they have 2 different desks for driver's license and plates. And there's only one line. So his job is to sort people out and make it more efficient. Well, this greeter fellow was just amazing. He was interacting with all different kinds of people, people who were friendly, people who were irritated, people who were just bored. And he had sort of a cheerful, pleasant attitude, making small talk, helping people get what they needed, just going the extra mile. And both times I went there, it was the same greeter and he was behaving the same way. Now, I'm sure he doesn't get paid a lot for his job at the DMV. It's what most of us would consider kind of a low status job. But he fully put his heart into it. And anyway, he helped me navigate the system and get what I needed at the DMV. But when I went to the desk and saw the clerk, she did her job. She was efficient, but she didn't look at me the whole time I was standing there. And she had sort of a bored attitude about her. Well, I don't blame her. I mean, it's a low-paying job, I'm sure, relatively, and rather boring and tedious to go through the same procedure again and again. But there was a striking contrast between how the greeter viewed his job and did his job and how she did. So to me, that greeter was a true bodhisattva, an exemplar of what I'm trying to be. So, right livelihood. I think I'll stop there and see if there are any comments. I again appreciate your coming, and if anyone is new to us here and wants to tell us a little bit about yourself, please feel free to do that. Again, thank you so much for being here.